And according to Herbert Spencer Salisbury in a lecture given before the Illinois Historical Society called The Mormon War in Hancock County, Joseph Smith should be included in these famous abolitionists who gave their life for the anti-slavery movement. According to United States Senator from Illinois, Senator Sherman claims that Mormons were driven from Missouri and then Illinois because they were active abolitionists and preaching anti-slavery. Can you imagine that a century and a half of Mormon scholars writing about Joseph Smith have failed to even mention the most burning issues that defined ministers?
Talk a little bit about the Missouri Compromise, and as far as Missouri's uncomfortable admission into the Union and how that factors into the spread of slavery and all of the things that were issues over the antebellum period. And keep in mind that we're looking at a turning point here, because the Missouri Compromise kind of informally kicks off the antebellum period, this period leading off to the Civil War. Now, first of all, we need to start with the doctrine of the equality of states. So in 1819, Missouri applies for admission into the Union as a slave state. And almost immediately, we see some opposition from Representative James Talmadge from New York, who proposed the Talmadge Amendment. Now, what the Talmadge Amendment did was it would make it so there was a system of gradual emancipation so that Missouri would eventually become a free state. When Missouri first applied for admission into the Union, you had one more free state than slave states. All right, so again, this is going to be the policy from 1820 to 1850, kind of an informal policy that we want a balance between slave and free states. But Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, and this alarms some people because it looks like slavery is spreading, and that will be a lot of the controversy of the antebellum period, not slavery in the abstract, but whether slavery is going to be allowed to spread to the West. You see here that, all right, we're going to put kind of a limit on slavery, and we're going to placate the people that are afraid that this is going to set a precedent for slavery spreading.
All ministers were divided into two groups: pro-slavery ministers and abolitionist ministers. Those were the Mormons. When Joseph Smith led his band of New England patriots to western Missouri in the early 30s and began preaching against slavery, the Missourians received them, as they did other New England abolitionists, John Brown, with fire and the sword. So in talking about the Mormons being chased out of Missouri, you'd expect Mormon scholars to address the problems with slavery and the anti-slavery teachings of the Mormons being at least a contributor to the Mormons being chased out of Missouri. Certainly, a high-quality, highly produced, expensive documentary outlining the history of the Mormon Church, just filled with Mormon scholars, would address some of these burning issues leading up to the expulsion of the Mormons from Missouri, which is the slavery issue. Certainly, these Mormon scholars would mention it in this documentary. Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong.
It is one of the world's fastest growing religions. Its members project pride in their faith and confidence in their future. They walk the corridors of power, leaders in Congress, and even running for president. But for the Mormons, it was not always so.
In the 19th century, to call someone a Mormon was akin to calling someone a Muslim terrorist.
Tonight, Frontline and American Experience join forces to tell the story of one of the most powerful, feared, and misunderstood religions in American history.
A column of light appeared in his room, and then a person came down, a very glowing person.
He says he's the angel Moroni. And so he begins to tell Joseph about the Book of Mormon.
This is the story of Joseph Smith and the revelations that gave birth to a new faith born in America.
What outraged the traditional Christians of the day was that this guy comes along and he says, I am the prophet for this new age.
The story of religious conflict and persecution.
When that mob stormed Carthage jail and shot the prophet Joseph, they thought they were finishing off Mormonism as a movement.
And the story of a people who crossed a continent to establish their own spiritual kingdom.
Brigham Young is telling the federal government to back off from the Utah Territory. We will take care of ourselves.
And of a church that for decades defied society by embracing polygamy and then abruptly abandoned it.
Well, if you thought that in this 2-hour documentary by Frontline that some Mormon scholars might mention anti-slavery movement and the Mormon Church and Joseph Smith's abolitionist activities, well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong. Because if the Utah Mormons admitted Joseph Smith's anti-slavery activities in the early Mormon movement, they'd also have to admit they criminally infiltrated the church, a legitimate Mormon anti-slavery movement, corrupted it, and led the saints out to Utah, where they quickly instituted a slave state and enslaved the Mormon settlers who were attempting to seek freedom and peace.
Police have just raided the Texas compound of the FLDS Church, a polygamist sect led by the notorious Warren Jeffs.
Yo, my name's Warren J, and I'm a PIMP. Got more kids than Angelina Jolie. You think we're hicks, but